3 weeks before the high society wedding of the season, a crisp, cream-colored envelope arrived at the quiet suburban home Grace shared with her husband. The heavy cardstock felt unnaturally weighted, embossed with gold leaf that gleamed like polished brass under the soft morning light. Addressed in flawless, flowing calligraphy, the name on the front read, Dr. Daniel Whitfield and Mrs. Grace Whitfield. It was an invitation to the wedding of her elder sister, Vivian Dixon, to Dr. Eric Holston, a prominent orthopedic surgeon. The letter had bypassed the usual gatekeepers of the prestigious Dixon family estate, delivered directly through the residential security gate. It was not sent out of warmth or familial longing, but simply because Daniel's esteemed reputation as a brilliant researcher made his presence a prized trophy for the guest list. Looking at the envelope, Grace felt a familiar, cold ache settling in the center of her chest. The name written on the paper belonged to a woman she had spent years building from scratch, yet the shadow it cast was unmistakably tied to the house she had escaped. The Dixon legacy had a way of reaching across time, using prestige as a hook to draw back those who dared to wander away. Sitting at her kitchen table, watching the steam rise from her mug, Grace realized that this invitation was not a hand reached out in reconciliation. It was a summons wrapped in velvet and gold, designed to remind her of the orbit she had once failed to inhabit. Daniel pulled out the chair beside her, his fingers gently covering hers as he looked at the open card. His voice was steady, a grounding anchor in the sudden tide of old ghosts. "You don't have to go, Grace. We can send a gift, write a polite card, and stay right here." Grace looked into his eyes, reading the quiet protection written there, but she slowly shook her head. To decline would mean leaving the past holding the key to her freedom. To attend was the only way to finally hand that key back. Together, they established what they called the wallpaper boundary, a silent, unbreakable rule designed to protect her peace. They would attend only the formal ceremony, sit in the very back row among the casual acquaintances, offer a brief, polite congratulations to the groom, and leave calmly before the reception turned into a grand theater of family politics. For the occasion, Grace chose a simple, tailored navy blue dress. It possessed no extravagant lace, no ostentatious jewelry, and no desperate bid to command the room. It was a quiet statement of quiet dignity, chosen deliberately to signal that she was no longer competing in a race she had long since abandoned. The navy silk felt cool against her skin, a gentle armor meant to shield her from the subtle barbs that always awaited her within her family's formidable, immaculate orbit. Her mind drifted backward, crossing the expanse of a decade to the echoing hallway of her childhood home, where the wall stood like a cold, demanding monument. It was a vast mahogany surface, hung with 11 silver-framed certificates, diplomas, and medical honors, each one marking a milestone in the Dixon family's relentless pursuit of academic perfection. Sunday dinners in that house were never warm gatherings. They were rigorous performance evaluations, conducted with the clinical precision of a laboratory test. The children were questioned on their grades, their research projects, and their extracurricular standings, while the roast beef grew cold on fine porcelain plates. In her mother's meticulously calculated ledger, Vivian was always celebrated as the highest yielding investment, a brilliant, obedient prodigy marching straight toward a surgical residency. Grace, on the other hand, was quietly filed away as a sunk cost. She was the child who struggled with high-stakes standardized testing, whose talents lay in empathy, art, and subtle observation, rather than raw academic metrics. At that dining table, love was never a natural right given freely to a child. It was a dividend paid strictly on measurable achievement. Every smile from her parents had a prerequisite. Every hug was conditional. And Grace had learned early on that failing to earn a top score meant sitting in the shadows, while the chosen child bathed in unconditional praise. The shift in her childhood had solidified on her 14th birthday, a day marked not by celebration, but by a chilling addition to the family display. Hanging at the very bottom of the mahogany panel, her mother had added a 12th frame. Completely empty, its white backing paper staring out like a blank, accusing eye. That evening, her mother had gestured toward the empty glass with a cold, thin smile that carried no warmth. Love in this family is not a charity, Grace. It is earned through excellence. This frame is waiting for you to fill it with your medical degree. Grace had stood in the quiet hallway for a long time after her mother walked away, staring at her own faint reflection trapped inside the blank space. The empty frame did not feel like an encouraging goal or a sign of hope. It felt like a sentence of permanent, conditional acceptance. It was a silent, daily reminder that until she proved her worth through elite credentials, her place in the household was merely temporary. She had said nothing in response, swallowing her tears in the dim light of the corridor, feeling the profound, subtle cruelty of a home where affection was treated as a currency to be bartered rather than a sanctuary to be shared. The blank velvet backing seemed to whisper that she was incomplete, a placeholder, waiting for a title she didn't want. The memory deepened, bringing back the suffocating heat of a summer night 10 years ago, her high school graduation party. Her parents had transformed what should have been Grace's celebration into an elaborate reception honoring Vivian's recent acceptance into a prestigious medical school. Surrounded by 22 relatives and distinguished colleagues in the formal dining room, her mother had raised a crystal glass to make a toast, her voice sharp and dripping with sweet poison. "To success," her mother had announced, looking around the room before landing her gaze on Grace. One child inherited the Dixon intellect, and the other, well, an ugly high school diploma is still a diploma, isn't it? A polite, uncomfortable ripple of laughter had passed through the room, while Grace sat frozen at the end of the long table. Her throat tightened so hard she could barely breathe, the humiliation burning hot against her cheeks, as her father simply nodded in quiet agreement. Instead of running away or making a scene, 14-year-old Grace had slowly picked up her fork, taking a small bite of the rich chocolate cake on her plate, forcing herself to swallow the sweetness through the bitter lump in her throat. She had survived that night by retreating deep inside herself, realizing in that heartbreaking moment that to survive her family, she would eventually have to step entirely outside of their world to find her own truth. Later that same evening, away from the harsh, cold judgment of the formal dinner table, Grace found solace on the screened porch with her grandmother, Ruth. The old wooden swing creaked rhythmically under their combined weight as the cool autumn night air brushed past. Ruth, a retired nurse who had spent 40 years on hospital night shifts, reached into her cardigan pocket and unbuckled her beloved stainless steel nurse's watch, the one with the red sweep second hand she had timed 1,000 pulses by. The metal felt warm against Grace's palm as Ruth buckled it gently onto her granddaughter's slender wrist. This watch has seen more people through the worst night of their lives than everyone in that dining room combined, Ruth whispered softly, her eyes reflecting the porch light. And not once did it ever ask a single patient their class rank or test scores. Listen to me, Grace. Nobody earns love, honey. Love is not a debt to be collected or a grade to be awarded. Sitting on that creaking swing, Grace felt the steady warmth of the watch against her skin, a priceless legacy of unconditional care that stood in stark contrast to the sterile, demanding world of her parents. In that quiet moment, as her grandmother wrapped a tender arm around her shoulders, Grace understood that her true worth was not defined by an empty frame on a wall, but by the quiet capacity of her heart to offer comfort to those in pain. The watch became her silent anchor, a sacred, lasting reminder of true, unconditional love. By the spring she turned 19, the subtle emotional exile within the family officially turned into complete financial disenfranchisement. Her father called her into his study, holding a crisp manila financial folder in his trembling hands. In his calm, practiced anesthesiologist voice, he informed Grace that her $80,000 college fund, accumulated since her christening, was being officially reallocated to cover Vivian's medical school tuition, books, and housing expenses. An investment naturally flows toward the highest return, her mother added coolly from the open doorway, weeding the decision like a routine weather forecast. Grace did not break down, cry, or plead. Instead, she quietly absorbed the painful blow and quickly adapted. Having already anticipated the storm, she had secretly opened her own bank account, gathered all her vital personal documents, and officially enrolled in an intensive night course for her certified nursing assistant credential. During the day, she worked shifts at a respected local home care agency, helping fragile elderly strangers shower with absolute dignity and assisting them with their walkers. While her parents viewed nursing assistants as menial domestic labor beneath the family's social standing, Grace found a rewarding purpose in the daily work. She loved the raw, honest human connection it provided, taking immense pride in earning her own tuition money, dollar by dollar. Each night shift reinforced her inner resilience, proving to herself that she possessed the strength to build a meaningful, honorable life, independent of her family's financial control and cold, conditional approval, moving forward with quiet, completely unshakable determination. The final ultimatum arrived on a humid Tuesday evening in April, at the bottom of the grand front staircase. Her mother stood with her arms crossed, while her father stood slightly behind her, quietly studying the carpet in complete silent agreement. Quit that agency immediately. Retake the medical school entrance examinations and resume the family trajectory, her mother demanded, her voice cutting through the quiet entryway like a steel blade. Or pack your things and leave this house tonight. Grace looked steadily at her parents, feeling a sudden, profound, comforting calm wash over her weary spirit. She went upstairs and packed all 18 years of her life in 40 brief minutes into 2 heavy black plastic trash bags. Her modest clothes, her CNA certification document folder, and Ruth's stainless steel watch fastened very securely on her wrist. Nobody offered to help, and nobody stood in her way as she walked slowly toward the front door. Just as she reached the threshold, her mother delivered her cold, final parting shot. "You are choosing to be a nobody, Grace." Grace turned her head, met her mother's cold gaze without even a single trace of hesitation, and replied softly, "No, I am choosing to be somebody you don't get to grade." She carried her trash bags down the long concrete walkway like expensive luggage, her head held high. Before she even reached the sidewalk, the bright porch light clicked off behind her, plunging the entire house into darkness. But Grace kept walking into the night, stepping forever, permanently out of their heavy shadow. Living in a cramped studio apartment located above a noisy laundromat, Grace took on night shifts paying $11 an hour to personally care for Mr. Alger, an 84-year-old retired industrial machinist with weathered hands as rough as ancient tree roots. Once capable of rebuilding complex engines, he could no longer manage the simple, small buttons on his flannel shirt. Working in his quiet home, Grace learned to shave a man's trembling face, time delicate daily medications using Ruth's sweep-second watch, and listen to the same familiar wartime stories with genuine, fresh attention every night. Her parents sneered at the work, dismissing it as wiping strangers. But Grace recognized it as the quiet preservation of basic human dignity. She realized that real healthcare was not born from the sterile, detached arrogance of a famous surgeon's scalpel, but from the humble, devoted, compassionate presence of a caregiver who refused to let a vulnerable human soul drop. Beside his bed, Grace kept a neat little spiral notebook, meticulously documenting every operational flaw she observed in agency management. Missed caregiver shift handoffs, double-booked home aides, and anxious families left waiting by unanswered ringing phones. She did not keep these notes out of personal bitterness, but out of a fierce, protective instinct to fix a deeply broken, cold system. From an elderly man who could not button his shirt, Grace learned far more about integrity and human value than 3 proud generations of framed diplomas could ever teach. Realizing that those who serve in the quietest corners of life often keep the world turning. When Grace was 23, tragedy struck her life with a devastating blow when her grandmother Ruth suffered a catastrophic, massive stroke on a Thursday in October. Grace discovered the heartbreaking news 2 days late from a neighbor because her family deliberately and coldly refused to call her. She rushed to the hospice, standing at the reception counter in her work scrubs, only to be turned away by a deeply compassionate receptionist. Her mother, holding legal medical power of attorney, had explicitly wiped Grace's name completely off the visitor list, effectively barring her from ever saying a final goodbye. 11 days later, Ruth passed away, and Grace was strictly barred from attending the family funeral as well. Sitting silently up at the darkened top-floor window of her parked car outside the hospice, Grace felt an agonizing, suffocating grief that threatened to consume her. Yet Ruth had managed to leave her one final gift, a 41-second voicemail recorded just a week before her tragic stroke. Grace sat in the quiet dark of her apartment, her thumb trembling over the screen as she pressed play. Her grandmother's warm voice filled the quiet room. "Gracie, it's your grandmother. Don't you dare delete this." But 12 seconds in, as tears blinded her eyes, Grace reflexively hit the stop button, unable to bear the overwhelming weight of hearing her beloved voice in the past tense. She saved that voicemail, keeping the sacred 41 seconds untouched for 5 long years. A quiet, beautifully preserved bridge to the only person who had ever loved her without conditions. 6 months after losing Ruth, Grace withdrew $12,000 from her modest, hard-earned savings and credit union, turning her deep grief into a solid foundation. She rented a modest 2-room office, sharing a wall with a lively dance studio, and officially founded Brightwater Home Care, a name chosen not for family heritage, but to evoke clarity, purity, and warmth, the exact opposite of a cold hallway lined with mahogany frames. Her hiring policy was just one simple sentence: hire those who genuinely show up. Taking the spiral notebook where she had meticulously documented every operational flaw from her previous agency, she turned every lesson into an unyielding rule: fair wages, reliable backup coverage, and deeply compassionate care. Recognizing her dedication, Mr. Alger's family provided crucial angel funding, allowing Brightwater to expand rapidly across the region. 5 years later, the small startup grew into a thriving agency, employing 340 dedicated caregivers across 3 states. Grace held a title she once thought impossible: founder and president. Yet, to those who worked alongside her, she remained the exact same grounded woman who personally understood every duty on a care plan every single day. Building Brightwater was never about proving her worth to a family that measured love in diplomas. It was about creating a sanctuary where human dignity was preserved without condition or grade. She had built an empire of quiet care, proving that true success is measured by the lives touched rather than titles held on a wall, standing tall as a beacon of quiet resilience and unshakable purpose. 4 years ago, a pivotal phone call permanently altered the trajectory of Grace's life. St. Anne's Regional Hospital had a highly complex patient no other agency would accept: an elderly retired teacher with a catastrophic spinal cord injury and complicated medical needs. The hospital's senior trauma surgeon personally called Brightwater, his deep, commanding voice demanding to know if the agency was truly as exceptional as its rising reputation claimed. Rather than backing down, Grace engaged in a spirited 20-minute professional debate regarding complex discharge protocols, fearlessly standing her ground until the surgeon chuckled in genuine appreciation and invited her to come prove her expertise. What walked into his office was not a typical sales representative with a shiny folder, but a founder with rolled-up sleeves who had personally performed every single hands-on job in healthcare. Daniel Whitfield, the hospital's brilliant 32-year-old senior trauma surgeon recognized something extraordinary in Grace. He noticed the worn stainless steel nurse's watch on her wrist and asked her about its history. A simple, thoughtful question that no one in 8 long years had ever cared to ask. Coffee from a vending machine turned into long conversations at a quiet cafe, gradually unfolding into 2 wonderful years of the calmest, most profound love Grace had ever experienced. Daniel loved Grace, not for her credentials or social standing, but for her fierce integrity, operational brilliance, and deeply compassionate heart. He saw the woman behind the quiet strength, loving her completely for who she was, and providing an unbreakable sanctuary where her deepest past wounds could finally begin to fully heal. 2 weeks before marrying Daniel, in an intimate backyard ceremony, Grace made one final, quiet gesture toward reconciliation by mailing a formal, elegant wedding invitation to her estranged parents' home. 13 days later, the envelope returned to her mailbox, but it was not marked with a standard post office rejection stamp. Someone had carefully opened the original card, read her name alongside Daniel's, carefully noted the date, and then neatly resealed it inside a fresh envelope, addressed in her mother's precise, icy surgical handwriting. On the back of the returned card, written in cold blue ink, was a single harsh command: don't embarrass yourself. Standing alone at her mailbox, while the neighbor's lawn sprinkler cycled nearby, Grace felt the familiar sting of cold rejection, realizing with painful clarity that her family still viewed her personal happiness as an unwelcome intrusion. Daniel quickly found her standing there, gently took the card from her cold, trembling hands, and silently read the brutal message. Rather than allowing anger to consume them, he pulled Grace into a warm, protective embrace, his steady voice anchoring her spirit. "We are going to live a deeply happy life together, Grace," Daniel whispered softly against her hair. "And living a genuinely happy life is always the absolute best form of revenge." They married surrounded by 30 cherished friends, Mr. Al Gore's granddaughter playing the fiddle as they exchanged vows. Grace kept that returned envelope safely inside a small cedar box, alongside Ruth's precious watch, a silent reminder of a closed door and the beautiful, chosen life she had bravely built without them. 2 full years prior to the wedding, St. Anne's Regional Hospital approached Brightwater to sponsor a brand new geriatric medicine fellowship, specifically designed to train young physicians in empathetic elder care. While the hospital board expected Grace to claim prominent naming rights, she attached one strict, non-negotiable condition. The prestigious initiative would be named the Ruth Chase Fellowship, honoring a dedicated nurse who gave 40 years to night shifts without ever receiving a single framed plaque or public recognition. Furthermore, Grace insisted on total personal anonymity, flatly refusing to let her name appear on official press releases, commemorative plaques, or annual promotional dinners. She refused to use philanthropy as a shallow tool for personal validation. Daniel gladly signed the official papers alongside her, serving simply as the trusted physician liaison and honoring her quiet desire to preserve true altruism. That spring, the foundation selected its very first fellow from a pool of 40 competitive applicants, a promising young internist known for his exceptional bedside manner, skilled hands, and a genuine, profound respect for bedside caregivers. He wrote a heartfelt thank you letter to the anonymous sponsor through the development office, expressing his deep gratitude for generously funding his medical future, without ever knowing the true identity of his noble benefactor. His name was Dr. Eric Holston. Grace had anonymously funded the dream of a brilliant young stranger, entirely unaware that fate would weave their separate lives together in a stunning twist, leading him to marry the very sister who had once cast Grace into the cold, dark shadows of obscurity. Entering the grand, dimly lit ballroom for Vivian's wedding reception, Grace's seasoned professional instincts, honed by years of auditing complex care plans, instantly picked up on subtle, unsettling anomalies surrounding her sister's wedding. As she observed the glamorous crowd, Grace noticed that despite Vivian's loud public claim of opening a high-end private dermatology practice, not a single attending guest on the bride's side was introduced as an actual medical colleague or professional peer. Furthermore, whenever curious guests asked direct questions regarding Vivian's clinical practice, their mother instantly materialized like an alert security guard, charmingly steering every single conversation backward to Vivian's residency years. Having spent 9 long years analyzing carefully curated family narratives, Grace immediately recognized the distinct, undeniable pattern of a deeply hidden truth. Beneath the laminated perfection of Vivian's flawless vows, something vital was clearly and silently hemorrhaging beneath the wedding gown. Grace harbored no personal desire for petty exposure or public drama. She simply observed the entire room with quiet, detached professional clarity. When Grace and Daniel finally reached their assigned table, Table 2, a sacred, highly coveted space reserved exclusively for the groom's most honored guests, Grace quietly watched across the crowded room as her mother quietly examined the official seating chart. For a fleeting fraction of a second, Dr. Lorraine Dixon completely lost control of her rehearsed composure, her face turning deathly pale as she realized the daughter she had erased was seated in a prominent place of honor alongside St. Anne's top medical leadership, setting the ultimate stage for an unavoidable, dramatic reckoning that would soon unfold before everyone. In the sacred geography of high society wedding receptions, seating arrangements and place cards serve as an unwritten, highly calculated map of power, status, and social intimacy. Table 2 was sacred, holy ground, stationed directly adjacent to the main head table, reserved exclusively for the groom's most distinguished guests, esteemed medical mentors, and honored family members. Standing near the entrance of the grand ballroom, Dr. Lorraine Dixon quietly scanned the calligraphy seating chart, fully expecting to see Grace relegated to an obscure, forgotten corner near the kitchen doors. Instead, her eyes halted at Table 2, where the engraved place cards clearly read Dr. Daniel Whitfield and Mrs. Grace Whitfield. For a breathtaking half-second, The polished, impenetrable mask that Lorraine had worn for decades slipped, revealing a sudden flash of sheer, unadulterated panic. Before she could intervene, Dr. Susan Holston, chief of medicine and mother of the groom, gracefully glided toward table 2 in elegant blue silk. Extending her hand with warm, genuine professional reverence, Susan greeted Daniel and Grace warmly. "Grace, it is an absolute pleasure to finally meet you in person," Susan announced, her voice carrying across the quieted circle. Eric speaks of Brightwater with the kind of awe usually reserved for world-class, prestigious teaching hospitals. And Daniel, our department has been trying to recruit you for years. Lorraine watched from across the polished parquet floor, frozen in stunned disbelief, as the daughter she had erased for 9 years was welcomed into the highest circle of medical authority, completely embraced by the very family her mother was desperate to impress and join today. As Susan Holston settled comfortably into the warm conversation at table 2, she tilted her head with polite, innocent curiosity and asked the one question that hung like a live wire across the table. "So, Grace, tell me, how do you know our Vivian?" Standing at the exact epicenter of 9 long years of accumulated pain, with the groom's powerful, influential mother holding the match, Grace felt the immense, suffocating weight of the moment. One honest sentence: "She is my sister. Ask her why you've never heard of me," would have detonated the wedding, shattered the carefully curated illusion, and destroyed her mother's social standing before the first course was even served. 9 years of returned invitations, trash bags, and cold rejection pressed heavily against Grace's spine, tempting her to pull the trigger. Instead, Grace took a slow, deep, steady breath and chose the absolute smallest, undeniable true statement available in the room. "We grew up in the same town," Grace replied, her voice smooth, calm, measured, and completely devoid of any bitterness. Susan smiled pleasantly, unaware of the nuclear, devastating explosion that had just been averted, and affectionately patted Grace's arm before drifting toward the head table. Grace's quiet response was not an act of weak submission or fear. It was a profound display of personal dignity, maturity, and civilized, mature restraint. She refused to weaponize her past pain or reduce her self-worth to a noisy public scene, proving to everyone present that true self-respect lies in refusing to let other people's cruelty dictate the quiet integrity of your own character. Before Grace could return to her seat, Vivian materialized at her elbow, her manicured fingers gripping Grace's wrist like a blood pressure cuff under the guise of a sisterly embrace, steering Grace forcibly through a heavy, arched side door into a quiet, cold stone hallway lined with lilies. Vivian led her into a private room where her estranged parents were already waiting. Her father, Raymond Dixon, 61 years old, stood near the window wearing an expensive, tailored tuxedo. A man who had spent 4 decades putting patients to sleep, and 1 long decade doing the exact same thing to his own moral conscience. For 9 long years, Grace had harbored a quiet, fragile, gentle fairy tale in her heart, convincing herself that her father was merely a helpless, soft-spoken hostage, a passive bystander trapped beneath her mother's domineering, cold tyranny. Standing silently before him now, for the very first time since she had carried her belongings out in 2 black plastic trash bags, Grace waited for a flicker of genuine recognition, a soft smile, or a hidden gesture of paternal warmth. Instead, Raymond looked directly at his younger daughter, his voice flat, completely emotionless, and bone-chillingly cold. "Use the kitchen door, Grace," he said, without greeting her, or even once uttering her name. There is a service corridor located directly behind the kitchen pantry. Do not make your mother repeat herself tonight. In that brief, chilling, heartless sentence, the quiet, hopeful fantasy Grace had once carried since childhood dissolved completely and permanently into the cold, unyielding reality of the sterile room. Her father's cold directive echoed sharply in the quiet, sterile room, striking Grace not as a fresh wound, but as a profound, liberating revelation. In that singular, powerful moment, she understood a truth that 9 years of absence had kept carefully hidden. Raymond Dixon had never been a hostage in his own home. He was a willing, active shareholder in the ruthless family enterprise. His silence throughout her childhood had never been the helpless, pathetic quiet of a victim, but the silent, calculating vote of a co-conspirator who agreed with every single cruel decision her mother made. He had simply let his wife read the board minutes while he quietly and contentedly reaped the social dividends of a curated, pristine family name. Something in Grace's chest that had been propped open on credit since she was 19 quietly, permanently shut down. The door to her longing for a gentle, loving father swung closed forever, leaving behind no anger or bitterness, only the profound, liberating stillness of absolute clarity. "No," Grace said very calmly, looking her father directly and dead in the eye. Raymond blinked twice, unnerved by a word that had likely never been spoken aloud in his presence. "I came through this family's front door once, with everything I owned in trash bags," Grace stated with unshakable, quiet composure. "I will never again leave any room or any place through the back door." Standing firm on her own firm foundation, Grace severed the final, painful, invisible tether binding her to their approval, stepping forever into total, complete emotional freedom. Cornering Grace near the coat check, Vivian leaned in very close, her bridal smile stretched unnaturally tight over raw, animal panic. "Whatever you just told Susan Holston," Vivian hissed under her breath, "you are going to walk it back right now." Grace looked at her sister calmly and asked the single, aching question she had carried to the estate. "What exactly did you tell them happened to me, Vivian?" Her sister looked her in the eye and delivered the stark, brutal truth. "There is no story. You don't exist. As far as the Holstons know, I am an only child. It was simply cleaner. But as Vivian demanded that Grace feign a sudden, convenient migraine and leave before the toasts, Grace's decade of grueling night shifts allowed her to read her sister's shaking hands. Vivian's fingers were trembling uncontrollably, not with typical wedding jitters, but with the terrifying shaking of someone defending a load-bearing, catastrophic lie. Grace suddenly realized the truth. Vivian's panic was not about a long-lost sister showing up. It was about the imminent exposure of her own fraudulent, fabricated medical career. Vivian had not opened a high-end dermatology practice. Her medical license had been quietly suspended due to severe, unforgivable, dangerous professional misconduct. A catastrophic failure her mother had spent recent years covering up. Looking at her sister trapped in a web of deceit, Grace felt no need for revenge. "Enjoy your toasts, Vivian," Grace said quietly, walking back toward the grand ballroom, leaving her sister completely alone to face the inevitable collapse of her own fragile stage. Inside the grand ballroom, the sharp clinking of silver forks against fine crystal signaled the formal start of the evening toasts. Eric Holston stood up at the head table, holding a small, neat sheet of handwritten notes in his trembling hands. The groom gave a warm, genuine speech, thanking his loving parents and smiling at Vivian, who glowed beside him in her laminated perfection. Then, Eric set his notes aside and went entirely off script to thank two truly extraordinary people who had fundamentally shaped his medical path. First, Eric said, his clear, steady voice echoing across the 200 listening guests, "I must thank my mentor, Dr. Daniel Whitfield at Table 2, who taught me that trauma surgery is mostly showing up." Applause broke out as heads turned toward Daniel. Eric continued, "The second person I can only thank tonight because she is finally in the room with us. I trained on a full fellowship that paid my salary and research, endowed by an anonymous sponsor in honor of a nurse named Ruth Chase. It took me 2 years to learn that the founder who built the company backing my fellowship is sitting right next to my mentor because she married him. Grace Whitfield. Ruth Chase was her grandmother." Eric smiled warmly, gesturing toward Table 2. Grace built a company from nothing at 23, and half our hospital discharge plans would collapse without her. The room erupted into applause as guests turned in their chairs, leaving Lorraine Dixon standing completely frozen in pearl gray, her wine glass stopping frozen mid-air. Before the warm applause could settle, Lorraine made a fatal, desperate strategic error. Panic surging intensely through her veins, she stepped forward with a hollow hostess laugh bolted onto her face. "There has been a slight mix-up," Lorraine announced into the quiet room, her voice noticeably strained and awkward. "Grace is merely a distant relation, a complicated private situation. Not for tonight." But Vivian, watching 9 years of meticulous messaging crumble before her eyes, lost her emotional control entirely. "You are not invited!" Vivian shrieked past the edge of the live microphone, her sharp voice piercing the held breaths of 200 guests. A suffocating, heavy silence fell over the vast hall. Eric turned slowly toward his bride, his face pale with sudden, shocking horror. "Not invited?" Eric asked, his quiet voice clarifying the horror. "Vivian, I invited her. This is the woman who generously paid for my fellowship. Her grandmother's name is on my diploma wall." Turning to Lorraine, who was desperately attempting to pull rank and control the damage, Eric asked pointedly, "Which family matter, exactly? Do you have any idea who this woman actually is?" From table 2, Dr. Susan Holston rose without hurry, her elegant blue silk gown rustling softly in the quiet. The chief of medicine looked directly at Vivian, with the cold, absolute precision of a medical diagnosis arriving. "Vivian," Susan said, her stern voice cutting through the stillness, "you told us you were an only child." The silence that followed was completely total, exposing the elaborate lie for everyone present to see. As the grand ballroom dissolved into stunned, chaotic whispers, Lorraine grabbed Grace's forearm with trembling hands, pulling her out toward the quiet stone corridor, where the string quartet's music filtered softly through the thick limestone walls of the estate. Stripped of her audience and polished lacquer, Lorraine looked like an exhausted 58-year-old woman, cornered completely by harsh reality. "All right," Lorraine breathed, her carefully built composure cracking completely wide open. "Here is what happens now. You come back inside. We tell the Holstons we've always been close, just private. The fellowship was a family project all along, your father secretly advised." She tightened her desperate, suffocating intensity, her voice catching with intense pleading. "And then you come home, Grace. Thanksgiving, Christmas, Sunday family dinners. The empty wooden frame on the wall, it gets filled. You finally earned your rightful place." Looking down at her mother's shaking hands, Grace noticed a fine, relentless tremor beneath the manicured nails. The very tremor that had quietly ended her mother's promising surgical career years ago. A physical vulnerability Lorraine had spent decades hiding, behind decades of bitter judgment. "My father made me recite my exact class rank at that table every single Sunday until I left for college," Lorraine suddenly whispered, her armor cracking for a single, heartbreakingly raw second. "I raised you in a family that keeps score, because it was truly the only kind I was ever given in my life." Yet, even as she spoke, Lorraine tried to rebuild her fallen curtain, insisting the Holstons were waiting in the hall for their immediate compliance. Grace looked at her mother with a profound, quiet pity, finally seeing the tragic cycle of conditional love that had trapped generations of the Dixon family. "No," Grace replied softly, her voice filled with serene, unshakable peace. "The frame stays empty, Mother. You can keep your wall of certificates. I've built my own home and family." She firmly but gently lifted her mother's hands off her arm, flatly refusing to participate in the lie or carry the transactional game any further. Returning to the grand main hall, Grace stood before Susan Holston and the 200 stunned, quiet witnesses. "I was born into the Dixon family," Grace stated, with calm, unwavering, civil clarity. "When I was 19 years old, I was explicitly told that in that family, love is earned, and I simply stopped earning. I haven't spoken to them in 9 years. Eric, you married a woman tonight. I hope you will ask her gently for the rest of the story. It simply isn't mine to tell." Refusing to weaponize her sister's fraudulent secrets or drag her name through the mud, Grace offered genuine mercy instead of bitterness or malice. She turned to her husband, taking her husband Daniel's arm with her head held high with quiet pride. "Excuse us," Grace said politely to the entire room. "This dress needs some fresh, cool air." Bypassing the back kitchen entrance her family had insisted she should use, Grace walked directly down the center aisle of the ballroom, stepping out through the grand, open front doors with her dignity completely intact. Outside on the cold, starlit terrace of the estate, the cool, crisp, deeply refreshing night air brushed gently against Grace's face as the distant music faded behind the heavy glass doors behind her. Daniel placed his suit jacket gently over her shoulders, standing beside her in quiet, solid support without asking a single question. Her hands began to shake, the honest, cathartic trembling of a woman who had finally freed herself from a lifelong emotional sentence. Taking out her phone, Grace opened the audio file she had carried faithfully for 5 long years, Grandma Ruth's 41-second voicemail. She pressed play, and as her grandmother's papery, warm voice reached the 12th second, Grace did not hit stop. For the first time, she let the recording play all the way to the very end. "And I need you to hear this, honey, because nobody ever told your mother," Ruth's voice echoed softly from the speaker, accompanied by the gentle creak of the old wooden porch swing. "Nobody earns love, honey. Love is the thing they can't bill you for. Whatever they do with that silly mahogany wall, you were never the empty frame on that wall, Gracie. You were the whole wall, and the house that it holds up." As the line clicked completely quiet at 41 seconds, tears finally spilled softly down Grace's warm cheeks. Not for the family she had lost, but for the realization that she had been worthy of unconditional love all along. Holding Ruth's watch against her wrist, Grace breathed in the crisp spring night air, completely healed, quiet, peaceful, and whole. Over the following 6 weeks, the crumbling structure of the Dixon family dynasty collapsed entirely under its own weight, requiring absolutely no intervention or encouragement from Grace. The Holston family, acting with the thorough, meticulous, disciplined precision characteristic of esteemed medical leaders, quietly conducted a quiet, private background audit of their new daughter-in-law. What they uncovered was a staggering, elaborate web of deception. Vivian's private dermatology practice had no physical lease, no active state medical business license, and no actual patients. In reality, Vivian's medical residency had ended abruptly halfway through her 2nd year of training. Not paused, but officially revoked due to severe, dangerous professional misconduct that her mother had spent years desperately covering up with social influence and personal money. 6 weeks after the wedding cake was cut, Eric filed for an official marriage annulment, handling the entire painful legal process with quiet, firm dignity, and keeping the Ruth Chase Fellowship title proudly on his official email signature. The social fallout was absolute and swift. Lorraine Dixon was soon quietly forced to resign her prestigious chairmanship of the hospital gala committee, citing vague family obligations, as her social currency dissolved completely in every high society room that mattered to her. Having built her entire identity upon performing for high society approval, her sudden loss of status was a complete, unbearable, inescapable punishment. Meanwhile, Raymond Dixon watched his pristine family name become a hushed, cautionary whisper among his medical peers. The entire empire of grand pretenses had completely fallen apart, leaving behind only the silent emptiness of the undeniable truth. In late November, as autumn leaves blanketed the quiet suburban streets, Grace received a single, unexpected email from her father, the first direct message she had received from him in 9 long, silent years. The subject line of the message was completely blank, and the body contained just 6 simple words. Your grandmother would have been proud. Standing quietly in her bright kitchen, Grace read those 6 words 30 times, quietly watching the cursor blink against the glowing white screen. For 9 years, a small, hidden part of her younger self had yearned for a gesture of validation from her father. But looking at the message now, she felt no sudden surge of anger, no sudden grief, and no desire to craft a bitter reply. She simply closed her laptop and quietly chose not to send a response. Her silence was not born out of spite or a desire for petty revenge. It was the calm realization that the Dixon family system had permanently and completely lost every ounce of jurisdiction or authority over her life. Her father Raymond's words, once capable of dictating her self-worth, no longer held any power or heavy emotional weight. She did not need a belated, desperate nod of approval from a man who had chosen cold, silent compliance over his own daughter. Both facts existed peacefully at once. He had finally acknowledged her undeniable truth, and she no longer needed or wanted his validation. In choosing not to answer, Grace quietly closed the final, heavy page of her past, stepping fully into her present, unshakable freedom. In the warm, light-filled dining room of Grace and Daniel's welcoming home, a new wall held 11 carefully chosen, elegant picture frames. Unlike the cold, sterile mahogany display in her childhood hallway, this wall contained no medical board certifications, no National Honor Society plaques, and not a single academic diploma. Instead, these 11 frames held the vibrant, beautiful, living milestones of a life built on unconditional, lasting love. There was a candid, joyful photograph from their intimate backyard wedding, a framed picture of Mr. Auger's old coffee tin savings can from the early days, a joyful snapshot of Grace on a fishing boat with Daniel, and a sweet, clear photo of a young local caregiver playing a fiddle. Hanging at the very center was a tender, quiet black and white photograph of Grandma Ruth, sitting on her sunlit porch swing in her worn, favorite blue cardigan, her gentle, loving smile captured mid-sentence, as if speaking warm words of enduring comfort across time. There were no empty, cold frames on this wall, no blank spaces waiting for credentials or professional achievements to earn a true place of belonging. Every photograph celebrated a real, cherished person who had genuinely shown up. A memory created through genuine, deep human connection, and a moment where love was freely and warmly given, without cost or condition. Looking at the wall, Grace often stood and smiled, knowing that these 11 frames represented a true, deeply loving home, a peaceful sanctuary where personal worth was measured simply, completely, and purely by who you were. On an ordinary Sunday afternoon, Grace looked down her long wooden dinner table and took inventory of her life with unhurried, thorough, deeply heartfelt gratitude. The room buzzed with joyful laughter, warm conversation, and the rich, comforting aroma of a delicious home-cooked meal. At the far end of the table, Daniel was engaged in an animated, cheerful debate about sports brackets with Mr. Alger's granddaughter, his face lit up with genuine, radiant happiness. Sitting alongside them were 3 of Grace's very original Brightwater home caregivers, the dedicated, brave women who had stood by her in the early days before the company could afford proper, full wages, and the kind, sweet, elderly widow of her very first client, who brought a fresh, homemade apple pie that everyone eagerly devoured together. Sitting across from Daniel was Eric Holston, who remained a devoted, brilliant Ruth Chase Fellow and had become like a trusted, beloved younger brother to Grace, telling a funny, light-hearted hospital story with his silver fork held high in the air tonight. This was the Sunday dinner Grace had truly always deserved. A vibrant, warm, welcoming table filled with people who loved her completely, truly, and unconditionally. There were no clinical laboratory grades assigned to the guests, no formal performance reviews, and no pressure whatsoever to prove one's value. Every seat was occupied by someone who genuinely showed up with an open, loving, accepting heart. Grace watched her chosen, beautiful family with deep peace, realizing she had successfully built the exact, peaceful, welcoming sanctuary her heart had long longed for since her early childhood. Grace quietly looked down at her wrist, where Ruth's stainless steel watch ticked with a steady, peaceful, comforting rhythm against her skin. A faithful heart keeping perfect time with her deep, inner peace. The quiet, old wounds of her past, the painful years of exile, and the heavy, painful burden of being misunderstood had all dissolved forever into the serene warmth of her home. Her journey was a living, timeless testament to a profound, sacred, and timeless truth that she wished to share with every weary, hurting soul still searching for belonging. If a family ever makes you audition for a seat at their table, or demands that you earn your place strictly through accomplishments, remember this. Love that must be earned was never, ever true love. It was merely a job with no emotional wages, a transaction coldly disguised as affection. And you have every right to quit a job that continuously drains your spirit. You do not need a ledger, a title, or a diploma to prove your fundamental right to exist. And you hold the power to walk away from cold, toxic tables and build your own beautiful table. Grace smiled brightly, holding her husband Daniel's hand tightly as her chosen family's laughter filled the warm, sunlit room, knowing that the table she had lovingly built would always have an open, welcoming chair for anyone seeking true, genuine love, quiet dignity, and unconditional, lasting acceptance. The 41 seconds were finally finished. The empty frame was gone forever, and Grace was finally, completely, truly, and beautifully home.